on and we'll be
We are going to be covering Mistress Anne Hutchinson. A sharp challenge to their authority came from Mistress Anne Hutchinson. By their authority, I'm referring to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A dissenter was Roger Williams, whom we already covered. Secondly, a couple years later, will be Mistress Anne Hutchinson. Now, the term mistress does not mean a kept woman or something negative. Back then, a woman was mistress. It has since been shortened to miss. A man was called master. That has since been shortened to Mr. So this is a very upright woman, Mistress Anne Hutchinson. She was an intelligent, strong-willed, talkative woman, ultimately the mother of 14 children. 14 children. That's an accomplishment in and of itself. Unfortunately, two of her daughters, died of plague before she and her husband even emigrated to Massachusetts Bay Colony. She began holding meetings in her home to discuss the sermon. Now, if a pastor sees people taking notes so that they can look over the sermon later and think about what was said, that is absolutely wonderful. But here you have people meeting another day of the week to discuss the sermon. Well, you would say, why is that a problem? First of all, she was a woman and she was holding meetings in her home where she was being the religious authority that you would turn to and listen to rather than a male. Secondly, she began to doubt some of the external codes of Puritanism. She said, if we were saved, we could live according to our own conscience. This was seen as spiritual anarchy by the leaders, and a trial was held. So her meetings, first of all, are creating quite a sensation, gathering large crowds, but her doctrine is what is off. She said, if we were saved, we could live according to our own consciences. There has to be a definitive right and a definitive wrong. And she was saying, it can be wrong for you, but it can be right for me. Anything that my conscience says I can do it. And if your conscience says you can't do it, then you shouldn't do it. We could live according to our own consciences. Well, the Puritans had set up codes, ways of living that you must abide by to live in their community so as to not invoke God's anger. If you go into the Old Testament, the children of Israel will be doing fine, and then it will say, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And problems will descend upon them. They'll get themselves into trouble, and God will raise up a judge who will come in and solve the problem. Then everything's going good for a while, and then it will say, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There will be 7 cycles of this in the Old Testament. And here you have, that we could live according to our own consciences. Once again, every man did what was right in his own eyes. You cannot have everybody choosing what their conscience says they can and cannot do. This was seen as spiritual anarchy. The trial is held, and being a very intelligent woman, knowing her doctrine, even her form of doctrine that she had come up with, she was able to go toe to toe with the clergy, with the administration of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But because they felt her doctrine was wrong, she would not win. Now, in 1635, Williams had been banished. It is now 1638 when she is banished from the colony. It is winter and she was pregnant. She heads down to Rhode Island where Roger Williams is. Ultimately, her child would be born a hydatiform mole. Now you say, what is a hydatiform mole? This is a medical term, and it's not very frequent that this occurs. What you have when you have conception is the egg and the sperm joining. It then subdivides and continues the cells to subdivide, and over a 9-month period, a viable, meaning able to sustain life on its own, a viable child is born. The cell globule that starts turns into arms, legs, head, backbone, the internal organs, all of that. A viable baby is created. With a hydatiform mole, you have something that goes horribly awry. The egg and the sperm join. They start dividing, and you have a cell globule forming. But instead of a viable child being created, you have a cell globule that keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it cannot sustain life. Are you pregnant? Yes, you're pregnant. Is your belly continuing to grow? Yes, your belly is continuing to grow. But the internal organs aren't connected how they should be. There's a finger here, there's a toe there, there's an elbow there. It's just this random cell globule that is created. This is considered cancer because anything that is a cell abnormality is cancer. And she gives birth to this hydatiform mole. Oh my goodness. What must the clergy back in Massachusetts Bay feel when they hear of this news? This is not a normal child that this woman has given birth to. This is some kind of devil, demon thing that she has created and given birth to. Oh, I forgot to show you. Here's Anne Hutchinson being driven out of town. And John Winthrop, leader of the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, he says this is proof of her blasphemy, of her wrong doctrine, that she gives birth to this hydatiform mole. Well, her family is living in Rhode Island, but her husband dies about 8 years later in 1643. Hutchinson then takes her younger children and goes down to the Dutch community of New Amsterdam, which we now know as New York. She does not take all of her children, but she takes her younger ones with her. While in New Amsterdam, despite warnings from her new neighbors to maintain vigilance against local Indian attacks incited by aggressive Dutch policies, the Dutch were even worse in their treatment of the Native Americans than were the English. And so, of course, the Native Americans retaliate against the Dutch with massacres. Despite warnings against Indian attack, Hutchinson and her children neglected to take precautions, trusting their destiny to God. A searing critic of the Pequot War, Hutchinson had showed a degree of respect and tolerance toward Native Americans rare among early English settlers. When an alarm gave warning of a native raid, Hutchinson chose to remain in place while her neighbors fled. Surprised to find their home occupied, Siwanoy, Siwanoy, Siwanoy warriors scalped Hutchinson alongside 6 of her children. They set the building on fire and burned the bodies. So Hutchinson and her 6 children that she has taken to New Amsterdam are massacred by the Indians. When news of this once again reaches John Winthrop in Massachusetts Bay, he says, "This is God's hand in her fate. We banished her. She gave birth to a devil child, and now the Indians have taken care of the problem, and she is no longer." Nearly 350 years later, former governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, formally pardoned Hutchinson from the crimes laid on her by Winthrop. So too late to help her, but she was pardoned by the governor of Massachusetts 350 years later. And here we have a statue of Anne Hutchinson with one of her children. She challenged the authority of the clergy and the very integrity of the Puritan experiment in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. An outcast in her day, she has been judged a heroine in the eye of history. This statue in her honor, erected in the 19th century, now graces the front of the Boston, Massachusetts State House. Oh, the Puritan clergy, John Winthrop, would be turning over in their grave if they realized that today her statue is gracing the Massachusetts State House. And if you have not yet read the article on D2L, Anne Hutchinson, A Very Dangerous Woman, please read it. There will be a couple questions from it on the test. And that covers Anne Hutchinson.